I've spent my entire career trying to figure out what is the best way to start these kinds of talks. A number of years ago, Chief Justice John Roberts came out to Brigham Young University, and he told us he spent his entire career by starting his talk with jokes about his profession. He said he wasn't sure if that was working too well because none of the lawyers thought the jokes were funny and nobody else thought that they were jokes. So then I thought I would try that for a while, but I just never had a good joke, never worked. And really my job description as a marriage researcher, there's not really jokes for that. So I've been trying to think, okay, so here's my new approach. This is my new idea of how to start. And it is to show you a picture of my grandchild. Why and what does that have to do with what we're going to talk about today? On the one hand, absolutely nothing. I just like to shamelessly show pictures of my grandchild. Little Calvin lives down in Houston, so a major part of our life these days is to try to figure out how we get him to us or us to him and take advantage of all the ways to connect with grandparents. In some ways, a picture of Calvin has nothing to do with what we're talking about today. But in other ways, it has everything to do with what we're talking about today. Okay? If someone asked me to describe myself in my career and what I do, I'm a marriage developmentalist. I study development that leads to different types of marital outcomes. And long ago, I had taught to me an idea that has changed the way I approach my work. And I think it's valuable for a lot of the purposes that we're trying to talk about at this conference. And this is the idea. Oh, first off, on that front slide, let me back up. We know that the screen's a little bit dim. It's not ideal for viewing. That's my email address right there. Just J. Carroll, get the 2 R's, the 2 L's, at byu.edu. Just say, hey, I was there. I'd like to get a copy of the slide deck. Happy to send it to you. Okay? So that way, if we move through something quickly or you couldn't quite see the details on something, happy to send you those slides, okay? Here's the idea. Here's the idea that I learned a long time ago. Optimal development is best understood as hanging from its apex rather than building on its foundations. Okay. Let me give you a simple example of that. A few years ago, my wife was able to travel with me to a conference. It was in the Boston area, and we had a chance to attend the Boston Ballet and witness and watch a ballet group at the pinnacle, right, of ballet performance. Development hanging by its apex doesn't mean we go back and say, okay, what's the beginning stage and where do we move? You go to the optimal. Go to the prima ballerina of the Boston Ballet and say, what was the step before? And what was the step before? And what was the step before? And that kind of working backwards, if you will, you link yourself, you attach yourself to an optimal. One of my main ideas for you today is that much of the slippage we see in our cultural conversations related to the key topics we're highlighting in this conference is a complete detaching from an optimal. People struggle to articulate, but let me highlight, articulate, but not struggle to desire. Okay? But they struggle to articulate those ideas. This is very tied into this key idea of making sure that we have a teleology, right? The purpose, the end. Teleology is the reason or explanation for something as a function of its end, purpose, or goal, as opposed to a function of its cause. In religious discourse and dialogue, this is often referred to as the idea of design. Indeed, a divine design. This is a critical starting point. And yes, I hold up Calvin as an example in my life of teleology, of an end, of a purpose, of a design. And yes, as we talk about the value of marriage, we talk about the value of parenting and the value of life, well, the pathway to grandparenthood is parenthood. Right? And so in some ways, it sits in that kind of vision, that kind of ideal, and that understanding. Now, why is this helpful to us? Because my whole purpose today, we're going to talk about marriage preparation paradoxes. Okay? Now, like a lot of words in the English language, paradox is used in a lot of different ways. So let's use a common understanding of how we're using it today. Okay, a paradox is a proposition that despite apparently sound reasoning leads to a conclusion that is senseless, logically unacceptable, or self-contradictory. In the simplest of terms, a paradox is doing something to get a particular outcome and getting the exact opposite. Okay? Perfect everyday example, my favorite, would be turning a jar lid the wrong way. You believe you're opening that jar lid, you're engaging in a behavior you think will open the jar lid, you're actually making it tighter. You're getting the opposite. It's not the desired outcome that is amiss, but the paradox is the behaviors that we believe will bring us to a desired end, but ultimately are frustrating those very ideals that we have. My primary proposition to you today is that we live in a culture saturated in marriage preparation paradoxes. Individuals who desire loving and lasting marriage, right? We'll get into the data here. This is not a sell job, right? There's been a little bit of a diminishment in the people in our culture today that desire loving and lasting marriage, but the desire for it remains high. There's not been a retreat from that. But what has been embraced, what is creating much of the difficulty, are marriage preparation paradoxes, behaviors that people are engaging in with the stated belief and stated intention will increase their chances of marital success, but these behaviors are being found on average to actually diminish the likelihood of success. And there's all sorts of faulty logic, faulty understanding, faulty framing around that. So the ways that we can raise and help elevate where needed, a better teleology, a better end, is very, very helpful. But also, how do we root out these marriage preparation paradoxes in ways that we can help see this? And if we can do this, we'll have a culture that is much, much better situated, right? For our purposes, we'll talk today about helping people be truly ready for and prepared for the creation of marriage relationships. So, as we talk about these, it's kind of an overarching theme. Please note how much of these marriage preparation paradoxes are rooted in what I would call the fragmentation of marriage. A fragmentation in our meaning and our understanding. We have rapidly changing views of what marriage means, and because of that, the M word is starting to be used fairly loosely to apply to a variety of relationships that look quite different than what we saw even a generation ago or so in this idea of its context. What are the three fragmentations? We see three primary fragmentations going on in our culture. The first is the separation of marriage from religion. So we have a decline of the sacred, right? And I talk about this across faith groups, across understanding. A few generations back, it was much, much more common for people to root their understandings of marriage into concepts of covenant, into concepts of devotion to God, into divine purposes. We see increasingly now people approaching this in a secular, private institution, private relationship, so to speak, approach. That's a radically different pattern than what we've seen in previous generations. We also see marriage increasingly separated from sex. So rather than being a way that was a transition to this part of life, a formation of this, we now see ways that it just is separated from and is not seen in that terms for most in our society. So we see a decline in chastity, and also we could say a decline in fidelity. And of course, we see marriage increasingly separated from children. Again, this is a relationship often of adults, for adults, by adults. Right? Notice how much, and find the opportunity to point this out when you can. We have a culture talking about adult relationships. Somehow they are detached, disconnected from children. There's fundamentally always a different conversation when we're talking about the needs of children, rather than simply slipping into a discussion about the rights of adults. So truly, this fragmentation, you'll see this kind of permeated throughout these paradoxes. So let's get into a few of these paradoxes and talk about them and see where they're at and see ways that we can perhaps help others see that these are truly paradoxical behavior. The prototypic example is cohabitation, right? No surprise to anybody, the percent of couples that engage in premarital cohabitation prior to marriage has steadily been increasing in our society. Now in the United States, close to 80% of couples now live together prior to marriage. Why do they do this? What is their purpose? There are some different reasons in some contexts and settings, but the research tells us that one of the primary reasons couples say they are living together is to test the relationship, to see if it's ready for marriage. In fact, what we see is a pattern of what you might call the test drive hypothesis, right? This isn't an unreasonable thought. Back in the 1980s and 90s, some of our best and brightest minds in the social sciences were claiming the exact same thing. That was the time when we saw cohabitation rates really start to increase, and many of our top social scientists claim we will see a huge decrease in divorce. Why? The belief, because the test drive, right? Cohabitation will act like some sort of Darwinian survival of the fittest mechanism that'll weed out the weak relationships from the herd. Only the strong relationships will survive, move on to marriage, thus a huge decrease in divorce. This has been one of the central questions of the family social sciences for the last 30 years. What have dozens and dozens of studies shown us? Does the test drive hypothesis work? Dozens of studies tell us it's the exact opposite. The premarital cohabitation effect is finding that those who live together prior to marriage are more likely to have more, not less, struggles in marriage. They have higher increase of divorce. What? How is this possible? How do we make sense of this? The key is to understand the faulty logic in the fact that cohabitation doesn't test drive marriage. Cohabitation is a fundamentally very different relationship than marriage. You might compare it to home ownership and renting, right? How many of you rent where you live? Okay, look around the room, some hands. How many of you would like new carpet in your rental apartment? Not you have to pay for it. You just want new carpet. You guys love your carpet in your rentals? Wow. Many people will be in a rental place would say, yes, I'd like that to be different. I'd like that to be fixed. I'd like that to be nice. And you say, yeah, then why don't you do that? Whoa. I'm not putting money into this apartment. Why not? I'm not even sure I'll be there at the end of the semester, right? I got a 3-month view. I have a short-term view. My investment in this is going to be based on that. What happens to homeowners? They take a long-term view. They take a different approach. Same type of dynamic happens in cohabitation marriage, right? The level of investment. Guess who knows this? This is one of those areas where academics and scholars, they're trying to convince themselves that even you couldn't even sell on the street if you had to. Guess who knows that marriage and cohabitation are profoundly different? Joe and Jane Cohabiter. Go grab Joe Cohabiter. Say, hey, Joe, I was at this fancy academic conference. I learned that cohabitation and marriage are the same. So why don't you just marry Jane? What's Joe going to do? Whoa. Did she put you up to this? You been talking to her mother? What's going on? Joe knows absolutely that the cohabitation deal, right, is very different than the marriage commitment. Okay? But somehow we tell ourselves that this is a reasonable test drive. This is no different than going down and test driving a car, going in and doing the paperwork, and they take it through the car wash and bring it out. It's not the car you test drove. So why in the world do you think that test drive actually will help you do this? Dozens and dozens of studies. Now, you may have heard, right? Some have said recently, hey, there's a declining impact of this. The cohabitation effect isn't as strong, right? Scott Stanley, Galena Rose. I'm going to throw out a lot of names and a lot of institutions to you today. So I want to show you places that you can go, people you can follow, people you can get into their work. University of Denver is a top group with this, the prep lab that is there. So they dug into this, right? The newest studies, there was a few studies that came out saying, hey, this impact of cohabitation is declining. Now notice, these studies weren't claiming cohabitation was having its beneficial effect. I want to highlight something here and just pause. Notice with everything I'm going to show you today, right? We're now with these paradoxes. People are fighting just to claim that they're neutral. Remember, the logic of the paradox is that they're beneficial. Even claiming that you're neutral isn't very effective. The claim is you're actually going to be benefited. You have greater likelihood of marital success, marital permanence, marital happiness if you go have it. Not just maybe we can get some backdoor way that you can be just as good as those who do. But a few studies are saying, hey, this is starting to decrease. But what we found out, though, is that a new analysis of this, there remains, as Stanley and Rhodes claim, there remains an increased risk for divorce living together prior to marriage. And the prior studies were only looking at short-term effects. In particular, they're only looking at the first year. So there's a couple of studies that claim that you may have a lower divorce rate in the first year through cohabitation. So if your goal for marriage is 1 year, that might be your ticket, right? And again, nothing will make you better, just be close to it. Every study that has gone and goes past that, which hopefully all of us have a vision of marriage past that, the effect remains. Hasn't changed. It's still there. Cohabitation, on average, leads to lower marital quality and higher divorce, not the other way around. It's a paradox. People engaging in that in an effort to improve their marital outcomes are actually, on likelihood, reducing and diminishing them. Okay? Unfortunately, this is true even when we see this with cohabiting parents. So someone say, come on, you're mixing this, isn't, the fragility of relationships and all that. Even when we look, so this is just something from the Brookings Institute here, shows us the rate of couples staying together. Your bottom line is your cohabiting couples, right? We know that children born into those contexts and in those settings face a great deal of risk, much, much higher for risk to live below the poverty line, other issues, because of the fragility of those relationships. So a couple of the explanations here. We're going to try to go through this. It will be a bit of our pattern today. We're going to try to hit some of the information, hit some of the data, look at the trends. Then I want to pull back out of it and say, let's get to the discussions. Let's get to the reasons, right? As Professor George was telling us, what are some of the reasons and arguments that we can go along with some of this evidence? So why? What can we explain? What can we see happening here? Why do we see this pattern of it? Let's go back to the work of Scott Stanley and Galena Rhodes. Okay? Their research over the last 2 decades has shown there to be 2 primary mechanisms, 2 primary reasons why cohabitation is not having its promised benefits that it's been out to have. First is what they call the sliding versus deciding effect. What happens often in cohabitation is people will select a cohabitation partner at a much lower level of criteria, if you will. It's akin to maybe selecting a roommate, okay? But what happens is often they move in, they have no context of a future, they have no exact idea where the relationship's going, but what happens is they become prematurely entangled, is the term they'll use. And these premature entanglements start to be the different ways that their life starts to get knitted together. Maybe they start to split rent. Maybe they get a goldfish. Maybe they, share a Netflix account. Maybe they have a baby together. Their life starts to get prematurely entangled. There was never intentional partner selection. This is what they would call a sliding relationship that just slide along into that context and setting. We see that sliders fare much, much worse in marital outcomes than deciders. And cohabitation often facilitates this. The other pattern we see is what Stanley calls asymmetrical commitment is very, very high in cohabiting relationships. This is where one partner has a deeper investment and a deeper sense of permanence than the other. Let me share an example of how this works. Scott and I were working, this is probably over 10 years ago, as we were research consultants for the National Healthy Marriage Resource Center. And we were charged to go around the country one summer and run focus groups in 7 cities across the country for this project. And they were grouped in the different cities based on relationship status. These were young 20-something, young adults. Some were married, some weren't married, some were cohabiting, some were mixed groups, some were men, some were women. In one group in particular, I believe we were in Nashville, we had a group of about 12 women in our focus group. And these were all women that were there as part of cohabiting relationships. And we had spent the better part of an hour. Our facilitator was asking them questions and doing things and had left them with a task and came back behind the observation mirror where Scott and myself and Dr. Paul Amato from Penn State were at. And she said, do you have any more questions you want me to ask the group? And this had only come from the mind of Scott Stanley. Scott's sitting there and he goes, well, let me back up for a second. We had spent the better part of an hour listening to these 10 or 12 women tell us the virtues of cohabitation, how happy they were in their relationship, and how this is exactly what they wanted. So Scott sent our facilitator back in with a few questions. This was the question to all of them. How many of you, if you went home tonight and your boyfriend, your live-in cohabiting boyfriend, proposed to you, would say yes? And the proposal comes with the condition that the marriage has to happen within the month. How many of those 12 women said they would accept the proposal? All 12. All 12. Then we had a 10-minute conversation about asymmetrical commitment. You want more from this relationship than your boyfriend does. And a whole new conversation started to spill out about the reality. In many ways, these women were simply playing along with the cohabitation arrangement because they felt it was the best they could acquire under the circumstances. But they truly desired something more. That type of asymmetrical commitment doesn't take a real relationship scientist to know. That's not good for relationships. Healthy relationship process, true equal partnership, true shared decision-making, true investment, true commitment, true caring and love. It's based on that type of having symmetrical commitment, shared mutual investment in a relationship. Not one person making sacrifices while another person is doing a hedge your bets approach with one foot in and one foot out. That is often facilitated in cohabitation. So again, these become the underlying dynamics that start to expose the cohabitation paradox for why it ultimately doesn't work very well. Okay? A few other examples. Let's talk about another one that I call the sexual chemistry paradox. Okay? This is the conventional wisdom that is becoming more and more common in our culture today that holds that couples, right, two people need to test their sexual compatibility with each other before they make lasting commitments. Because no one wants to find themselves in a relationship, of course, right, and not have sexual chemistry. Now, we can have a whole other fun conversation about what exactly is sexual chemistry. Most people kind of treat that a little bit like they define, compatibility. I teach the marriage preparation courses at Brigham Young. So, over the years, I passed my 10,000 student mark a few years back. And asking, what is compatibility? People always use circular reasoning. It's like, well, compatibility. It's like when two people are compatible with each other. You can't do that, right? What is sexual chemistry? I don't know, but I'll know it when I experience it, right? I better go see if I can find it. But this is becoming the common notion. And you can go along. We've looked at all the different sexual ethics that are out there. At what level do people believe? Some people is like, well, until I know I've got sexual chemistry, I won't even get exclusive with somebody. Or maybe I'll get exclusive, but I'd never get engaged to somebody until I know I've got sexual chemistry. Oh, I definitely wouldn't get married until I knew I had sexual chemistry, right? This is the common idea. This is what needs to be tested because you want to make sure you don't fall into that, right? So again, what is the paradox? The paradox is that couples who don't do this, if you get into a relationship and you exercise sexual restraint, you exercise chastity, you exercise, right, this pattern of restraint, you're setting yourself up for risk. You're going to be the couples that will come along later and say, oh, you wish you tested that. You need to figure that out. This is very, very different than this idea of the benefits of sexual restraint, right? My colleagues and I have worked on this sexual restraint model for a number of years, right? Trying to test it in socially science empirical ways because those types of evidences we find are helpful for us. Let me just also make one comment here. I think it's really important for all of us to learn the ability of what, you can give it another term if you want. I call it shadow modeling, of how I talk about different topics or ideas based on the audience I'm talking with. In my mind, at least, and in my experience, I've always tried to have at least three models that shadow each other. One I would call my faith model. When I'm speaking to people of my faith who share my testimonial language, right, and understanding and belief in doctrines and ideas, I can use that language set, right? Oftentimes I'll be speaking with people of faith, but of a variety of faith groups and understandings. There's a language set that will often fit there. Right? Then there's also this kind of general model, if you will. I think it's very helpful to become multilingual in depending on who we're talking to, what evidences people will respond to. So please know from my vantage point, right, I see these social science indicators and this data. Fundamentally, in my worldview, they're second witnesses. They're not primary witnesses. But they are fundamentally ways that many will pause. Because often the claim is, you have no evidence. right? That doesn't show up. Oh, it shows up all around us if we're willing to pay attention to it. And people are willing to do the work and actually oftentimes do the research in the ways that will show these patterns that are there. So we've been looking at this pattern of sexual restraint in this context. The simplest idea that I want to capture for you here at the root of this model is we've got to get away from the cultural myth that sex is just sex. And the only thing that can change, right, is whether it happens or not for two people, or maybe the timing of when it happens. The context of the relationship doesn't just change this in degree, it changes it in kind. Again, it's a myth to fundamentally believe that somehow in a non-committed relationship context, we can test to get a sense of what would truly be in that context, particularly a full commitment around that. So we've been testing the hypothesis that maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's the couples who delay. Maybe it's the couples who abstain that allow other relationship foundations to come in place. In many ways, this is a fundamental shift in model. Sexual chemistry treats the sexual part of the relationship like it is the cornerstone, and then you build on top of it. Sexual restraint thinks about sexuality in a relationship as a capstone that they can symbolize and connect to all of the other rich parts of the relationship, which indeed give it true meaning, give it true understanding in that experience. Well, the sexual chemistry pattern in our society is quite popular. Looking at the AdHealth data set, this is a large 90,000 census sample data set. Looking at the sexual tempo at which young adult couples become sexually active, we have 50% of couples saying that they become sexually active very quickly. In fact, before they are couples. In fact, it is part of their coupling story. Right? How did you become a couple? Well, we had sex. It was kind of the hookup that we kind of kept going. So we see a pattern here where many couples, sexual initiation is very much at the foundation of their relationship. We see another group that has a bit that delays it some, but we see in most data sets now only somewhere between 6 to 10% of the sample will report waiting until marriage, waiting until those markers of commitment to happen. Because of this, not anything that we delight in, but something that's a reality, we actually have a living test that we can actually test sexual chemistry ideas. Because we can actually now look at couples as they get into marriages and they have different sexual histories. And we can see, do those histories seem to predict any different patterns that they have in their outcomes and their trajectories? Well, it wouldn't surprise anybody in this room, but it might surprise plenty of the people that you talk with. This is a paradox again. What happens to these early initiators? Remember, the claim here isn't that these will just be even. The early sex initiators, right? The idea will be that they will be better off, right? They tested this. They tested it and went forward with the relationship. They know they have the right thing. They make sure that they have that. Who should be the couples at risk? It's these couples who waited till marriage. They're at risk. How do you know? How do you know if you have sexual chemistry? There's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the origins of sexual chemistry are here. But the data shows us very clearly. When we look at measures of marital satisfaction, we look at the stability of the relationship. If you see that term stability thrown around, if you're not measuring divorce, that means couples that are thinking about and talking about ending the relationship. They report how frequently they're having those types of thoughts or conversations. We look at the measure of their sexual quality. This one was unique because this actually was a 3-part measure of sexual quality that not only looked at their satisfaction with it, also looked at frequency, and also looked at a reverse scored measure about how much sexuality was a problem in their relationship. So the married sex couples, those who waited till marriage, actually were saying higher satisfaction, more frequency, less problems with this. There goes the paradox. It doesn't hold up. Relationships are not at risk at all from that pattern. And in fact, all the evidence shows us that we're benefit. Now, I have to do this next one just because I'm very transparent about these things. I've shared this slide on a few occasions, and someone will go, "That's your name up there, right?" Yeah, that's our team. That's a BYU group, right? Yeah. That's our lab at BYU.
What do you expect from a BYU study on sex? I mean, come on. Of course that's what you guys do, right?
So, the next part of the story, this study comes out about 6 months later. I get an email from Sharon Sassler at Cornell. It's a one-line email that says, Jason, I hate you, Sharon. Like, Sharon, what's going on? She goes, just sent my article out for review. Just got the reviews back. They love it. They're going to publish it. They just told us that I had to rewrite the first 2 paragraphs. I said, why? What's wrong? She said, well, our study claimed to be the first study ever done on sexual timing. And they wanted to point out to me that your study came out 6 months earlier. And so we now have to say that we're a replication and an extension of your findings. I would hate me too, Sharon. The Cornell team found that early sexual activity in the relationship was linked to subsequent cohabitation and less satisfying marriages. In fact, it is the case that people who take longer to become sexually intimate with their partners report significantly greater levels of sexual satisfaction. So we always engage in this and looking at the cumulative effects in the number of the studies. But the empirical evidence shows us there is absolutely no harm. In fact, there may actually be harm, right, for that early pattern and that sexual chemistry testing pattern of things. Now, let me show you on this graph here. Elaine and I were talking about this during the break. I don't consider the sex therapy models that we have to be very good models to understand about a fullness and a depth and a richness of marital intimacy. But there's been some progress even in those circles, okay? Unfortunately, we have a culture that is still largely grounded in the sexual response cycle work of the 60s and 70s that completely defined sexual response based on biological markers and indicators, right? You probably had it in a health class, you've had it somewhere. These are the phases of the sexual response cycle, right? And they're described as a single person moving through these phases. There's no sense of couple experience or shared element of that. But even in the sex therapy models, we're starting to see a recognition of how fundamentally problematic, right, those types of views are. David Schnarch and others that have been leading this work, right? Typically, we have a discussion in our culture and even in professional circles about sexuality that largely just tries to connect the top 2 boxes. We talk about sexuality as if it is simply a physical experience. And the quality of the physical stimulation then leads to the quality of the physical outputs. We're done. Even the top marriage therapists, based on the most recent models, are saying, that's not what we see at all. This is how we start to understand. Why is it that these delayed married sex couples actually have the highest satisfaction? Because guess what? They understand that there's a bottom left box. And that the psychology of sexual arousal far outsees the anatomy of sexual arousal. When those come together, we have the opportunity for the physical outputs, right? I always tease my students in marriage prep. I'm not talking about some model of sexual cuddling here, okay? This is a model of just spiritual cuddling that, oh, well, we go to this is actually understanding how our bodies work and function as well. The body will only go where the mind goes. The mind will only go where the spirit goes. So ultimately, when we ignore that, we don't see that pattern. But the key here, too, is it's not just that this is a key part of setting the stage for the experience that is shared. These become, in many ways, the most meaningful and enduring of the outputs of sexual experience as well. And if we made this model, if I was to take Schnarch's model and extend it, I bring the arrow back this way. Because these outputs then set the foundation for the psychology, as he calls it, of the sexual response. So in many ways, relationships that take time to develop the friendship, the communication, the shared activities, the shared vision of life, right? That true sense of unity, that side-by-side journey of life approach, when they then add the capstone of physical and sexual intimacy, it's in that context of commitment and therefore can have so much more meaning. And not just in a psychological sense, but even in a physiological sense, we'll experience a different experience. Until that's understood, we have a culture that will still continue to be perplexed by, of course we need the sexual chemistry testing. Of course we need that type of pattern. Let me push this along here a little bit so we can get to questions. An extension of sexual chemistry testing is what I call the sowing wild oats paradox. Okay? This is the idea that is widely held in our culture, that young people, it used to be just young men, but of course in our quest, as we heard last night, right, equality in all things. Equality equals a sameness, a mutuality. So now I think it's held out for almost all, right? That there's this idea that you better not get married without having had some sexual experience, right? You need to kind of sow your wild oats, and that's the phrase we use, to get it out of your system. Well, we've led a little paradox, so by now you know how this is going to go, right? Well, once again, this seems to be a pretty popular paradox in our culture today. This is just a simple measure of lifetime sexual partners, right? From the National Survey of Family Growth of men and women ages 25 to 29. We see that we have a number of people in our society today that are starting to have a fairly high number of sexual partners by that time in their life, right? So this idea of this pattern of, hey, I'll wait to settle down. Married life is going to be different than single life. I'm doing single life now. I'll do married life later. And all this is going to do is give me more experience. It's going to help me know what I want. It's going to help me when I finally commit to a relationship that I will then make a better selection than you because you haven't really seen or experienced what is out there, right? That's the way the mindset goes. Well, surprise, surprise, right? In our research on this, we find that spouses who've had multiple sexual partners before marriage, they have lower sexual quality, communication, relationship stability in their relationship. And this holds true when we control for a wide variety of factors. So again, neither the sexual chemistry or the sowing wild oats, right, hypothesis holds up. Okay? Let's talk again about some of these reasons. These are more some ideas that I've already been hitting here, right? This idea of sexual symbolism. I was mentioning the work of Snarsh. He says current views of human sexuality have failed to account for that characteristic which sets human sexuality apart from that of other species, the human capacity for intimacy and attaching profound emotional meaning to sexual experience. We're basically a culture engaged in full, wide-ranging sexual objectification. Talking and treating ourselves and others as if we are just simply bodies that can engage in a physical experience. This simply denies the reality of human capacity and human relationships, and therefore sets the ground for these types of paradoxes to flourish in their thinking. Our team works with a model that we call a sexual wholeness model in marriage, where we try to talk about the integration of different dimensions, different parts of ourselves. It's always a problem having a model that says wholeness, right? And then it shows you parts. Don't you love that? It's like we're always kind of stuck in this little temporal world that we're in. We don't go like a part and a piece at a time. So it's not meant to pull these apart like they're separate, but it is at least to highlight this idea that each of us live and have a meaning dimension. I'd say for people of faith and even people who don't acknowledge that faith, I would also be comfortable calling this a spiritual dimension. Right, where we have a sense of whether or not sexuality is aligned with our values, who we desire to be, what we want it to be in our life experience. We also understand sexuality having its deep, profound, emotional element, right? And then this idea too of recognizing the physical dimension. Our culture is one that is fragmented because it pulls this dimension out alone and somehow doesn't try to connect it or highlight it. So when we talk about sexual wholeness, we're trying to talk about an idea that involves whole person love, where we see and treat others as feeling, thinking, acting persons. And the simple idea is when you or I touch a body, we touch a whole person. Their mind, their emotions, and their soul. That simple idea right there is a key to knowledge that changes everything. It should change how we think about sexuality, how we talk about it, how we view others, and definitely in our relationships, how we ultimately treat and interact with others. 3 ways that I think it's helpful for us to think about sexual wholeness. What would be this notion? 3 things that have to be integrated, right? There has to be an integration of the physical and the emotional. Okay? Insert any word you want there. Take the language system of whoever you're talking about, right? If I'm in a spiritual context, I'm talking about the union of the body and the spirit. Right? But if someone resonates better with connecting to the physical and the emotional, right? Connecting with the body and the self, the authentic, right? Whatever language captured. I have not found it to be a hard thing to help people, that people will nod their heads and say, we're more than just bodies, right? Yeah. What language do you want to highlight with that? That's fine. those have to be integrated to their wholeness. Anytime that there's this fragmentation, which of course would fit any culture that emphasizes casual hookups, right? This idea of friends with benefits, this idea of, hey, we're just going to share our bodies with each other, but hey, leave your spirit at the door, leave yourself at the door, leave your emotions at the door. That's fundamentally, humanly impossible. And we deny it in ourselves and we deny it in others if we believe that. Those have to be integrated. Of course, this is meant to be the grand symbol of husband and wife union in marriage, to set it apart from all other relationships, right? Again, not as a cornerstone, but as a capstone of their relationship. Therein becomes a powerful commitment symbol that we may ultimately tarnish and diminish to believe that somehow we can treat it without that symbolic power before marriage, but then somehow endow it with that power within marriage. Either we treat it consistently across relationships as having that type of endowment of power, that uniqueness of symbol that we can fundamentally give to and share with each other, or fundamentally we treat it with a different notion altogether. And then, as we were saying, this idea of connecting it to our meanings and our values. And in a spiritual context, this would be fundamentally connecting a couple with God, that in many of the world faiths is understood as a sacramental nature. Deeply, deeply sacred, connected to powers of procreation, connected to the formation of families, and in ways that create a true meaning of the idea of wholeness that we would never have without connecting to it. We're talking about these types of wholeness between the body and the spirit, between the husband and wife, between the couple and God. That's teleology. That is optimal development. That we can move back and then say, what would be the forms of dating, of courtship, of even expression in marriage that will ultimately reflect that? Or what are all the ways we can portray that opportunity and that possibility? I am going to move us quickly here, okay? I had to do this. This wasn't there, but I had to shove it in. We have a report coming out in 2 weeks at the Wheatley Institution, okay? This is not a live link, but ask for the slides. I'll send it to you on November 9th. It'll go live. We've had Brian Willoughby, Galena Rhodes, the University of Denver, and myself have been working on a new study. This is probably the best couples data set that's ever been gathered about couples and how pornography is influencing their relationships. This is a very unique data set because it is a national data set and we have matched couples, okay? Most data sets, that even when they look at marriage, they still have women talking about their marriages and men talking about their marriages, but their spouses aren't in the study. When you have both of them in the study, you can compute different types of outcomes. You can look at different scores. You can look at how often he says he uses pornography, and look at how much she thinks he uses pornography, and is she accurate in her assessment and these types of things. So, just as a quick understanding, right? Pornography is quickly becoming one of our main paradoxes again. And maybe not so much. I mean, some people will talk about it as being beneficial, but at the very least, maybe it's a half paradox. It's definitely put out there as it will do no harm, right? This is just harmless adult leisure. It's you Sunday school types that are getting too uptight about this. Relax. You're making it into a problem, right? Is that what we see? How do we see it impact couples? As a little sneak peek to what we have coming out in a couple of weeks, we find that in a national data set of cohabiting and married couples, 1 in 5 of couples today in America are reporting conflict in their relationship due to pornography. And, I don't have it here, we also find that there's a large portion of couples, well over half, that don't talk about pornography and don't have conversation. So the conflict levels will probably just be higher once they actually knew what was going on. Many of them have decided that to put their head in the sand is somehow, conflict avoidance is a good way to avoid conflict. Right? So they're not talking about their scripts, they're not talking about what's happening in the relationship. This is where we get real concerned. 1 in 4 of the men, right, of their own self-report say that they hide pornography viewing from their partner. Either the partner's not aware of it or doesn't know the degree, and they definitely don't know the duration and the content of what they're looking at. And in our report, we didn't just look at frequency, we looked at duration and content as well. Because every relationship ultimately has to decide what its boundaries and what its patterns will be around this. Unfortunately, tied to this, we do see that 1 in 3 of the women in this country agree that they're worried about their partner withholding details about pornography. It lurks beneath the surface, and it's disrupting their intimacy in some significant ways. 1 in 3 of dating women in our sample reported that they worry that their partner is more attracted to pornography than they are to them, and they're worried that they're thinking about pornography while they're being intimate. That doesn't sound like goal-centered, person-centered love to me. That actually sounds like something very, very different. Starts to sound pretty manipulative and pretty much using another person for personal gratification. Right? Not quite as high, but we still see that even among our married women, that 1 in 5 are reporting the same anxiety. A graph for us here to digest. This is one I think is kind of the centerpiece of the report. Because we have the matched couple data in this, we are able to look at these patterns, as I said. Right here, these 4 bars, these are all of the couples where both partners are not using pornography, okay? And we're looking at their stability, their commitment, their satisfaction, and their sexual satisfaction. These are relationships where the female has no use, but the male's using a little bit. This is where they both have some use. Female some, male high, both high. Look what happens as the amount of pornography increases in relationships from one or both of the partners. Oh, this is just a way to add spark to our foreplay. This is just a way to keep things creative. It's just a way to keep things like what? Look outside our relationship, put different ideas and images in our minds that have nothing to do with what we share together. Talk about taking that capstone, right? How can this act as the symbol, the grand symbol of a couple's relationship when, oh, our bodies are together, but our minds are, it's a new form of sexual fragmentation. This is meant to be comprehensive, as Professor George would call it. We bring all of ourselves to that, not just our bodies, our minds, our spirits, our love, our devotion, our commitment, right? We see this ultimately playing out. If this isn't playing out. And the scariest one of this is this right here. Look how much the stability of those relationships are starting to crash. Those are people starting to think about and talk about getting out of their relationships. Okay? My time is far past. I'm going to go through some slides here. These highlight this idea. I think this is why, in our ability to help people see pornography, never talk about pornography disconnected from full relationships. You have to talk about it in connection to sexual wholeness and sexual wholeness in marriage. We can only fully understand how much pornography is a counterfeit when we understand the true reality of what could and should be, right? So we need to emphasize this, particularly with young people. Because also the other problem is sometimes if we just warn young people and teens about pornography, but we don't teach them about healthy sexuality, they start to believe that we're anti-sex, right? We're just, oh, that problem's with all that. No. We're as pro-sex as you can be in the fullness of what we have the human capacity to experience, right? So those unintended side effects around those patterns. We got a bit here about the older is better paradox. People have emphasized for a long, long time, and our culture seems to really be embracing that the older you are, the better off you'll be, right? So people are often setting arbitrary ages, the age of marriage that needs to be there. We've understood for a very long time this part of the equation, right? So this is looking at the probability of divorce connected to the age at the time that marriage happens. Is age of marriage connected to the chances of divorce? Yes, if one or both of the partners is teenagers. If you'd like to join me for the next 3 weeks, we'll go around and see if we can find those 4 people in the country and where they're at. It's not quite that low, right? But we're still having a conversation in this society about age of marriage that really doesn't fit. Because we don't really have a lot of teenage marriage in our society today. What happens that we have understood historically, that age benefit goes almost completely flat by the time people move into the early 20s. Age is not a very good predictor. But that's the historical pattern. That's what Nick Wolfinger did to the world 7 or 8 years ago. He reanalyzed the same data set with the new data. That's the new curve. Not only do we see that effect going, but now we start to see a curvilinear relationship between them. Okay? Fundamentally, once we get into the 20s, even this data here, you can be wrong to interpret. Age is not a very good predictor. That shouldn't be a big surprise to us. Chronological age, by the time you get into young adulthood, Chronological age is a very poor indicator of almost everything. Maturational age. That's what matters. And we live in a society that's got plenty of 24-year-olds that are more mature than 44-year-olds, right? It's the things people commit to. It's the values they have. It's the things that they're willing to sacrifice for, that they're willing to be involved in. We need to have a culture that emphasizes this. So my final thought here, right, is because what's happening for so many is they're pushing off, as we see marriage getting pushed further and further in the life force. Not only do we see tremendous declines, we're at all-time historic lows of fertility now in our country. But what's happening for many people is they start to view marriage as a transition of loss rather than a transition of gain. Their focus is on what will I give up? What will I lose? What can I not keep doing? Versus the idea of it being a transition of gain. What was added to my life? What do I have now that is a part of this that wasn't? Previous generations viewed marriage much, much more as a transition of gain. It's only now that it's getting framed off in this pattern. So what we need to do is actually promote the individual and couple factors that are strong predictors of marital success. There's a long research tradition of marriage prediction research, right? I always ask my classes, like, you know, they all come in and say, how many of you heard that there's a 50-50, chance of divorce in our society? It's gone down a little bit from that, but they all raise their hands, right? And I tell every single one of them, if you believe that divorce is a 50-50 chance, you absolutely have my permission to freak out. We know why relationships come apart, but the understanding of the individual factors, the personal maturity, right? The ability to learn to regulate mood, to avoid addiction, to handle these types of patterns, the couple processes of healthy communication, the ability to handle conflict well, the ability to build consensus, right? The importance of commitment, the importance of true enduring love. These are the things that we've retreated from. We have an entire generation that said, where do they get this? Where do we teach this? Where do we make this a priority? Otherwise, we're just kind of going back to the arbitrary of saying, well, don't get married until you're 25. Don't get married until you're 30. Wait till you're 35. Because we just assume that older is better. We don't have any evidence to show that to be the case. In fact, we see a lot of evidence that there's plenty of marriages that are 20-something marriages. They're doing as well or better in most of our data sets than many of these couples that we see that are pushing later. Let's stop there.